Slavery, weirdly, was a huge business back then. Despite the royal family persistently denying the crown's involvement in this filthy business, many historians have proved their devoted involvement throughout history. Stay watching as we show you some of the British royals who took part in this evil business, how they benefited from it, and were they some royals who stood against this inhuman activity? Before we dive into this incredibly revealing video, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to this channel. So, who were the money-loving royals who dipped their fingers into the pot of slavery? Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I, popularly known for her lethal makeup that sent her to her grave, reigned from 1558 to 1603. She benefited from this filthy business through a slave trader by the name of John Hawkins. John Hawkins made multiple expeditions where he violently captured African slaves. On his biggest voyage, he captured about 300 Africans in Sierra Leone. Guess what he did with them? He transported them to Spanish plantations in America and traded them for pearls, hides, and sugar. Queen Elizabeth I wanted some of these juicy profits, so what did she do? She decided to sponsor Hawkins' activities. How? You ask. She provided Hawkins with large royal ships, supplies, and guns. She even gave Hawkins a unique coat of arms bearing a bound slave. How absurd! Well, this support gave her the opportunity to get some significant profits off Hawkins' voyages as extra resources for her and her people. With the Queen's support, Hawkins went on multiple voyages and traded more than 1,000 African slaves to Spanish settlers across the Atlantic. King Charles II. Did you know that the monarchy of England once got dissolved? A man named Oliver Cromwell declared Britain a republic. This man went on to become Britain's Lord Protector from 1649 to 1660, a period known as the Interregnum. Charles II became the first king after the restoration of the monarchy and reigned from 1660 to 1685. How involved was Charles II in slave trading? This king went deep into this business when he made slave trade a state-sponsored business. He invested in a company known as the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading into Africa. A charter was provided to this company to search for gold initially. But the king might have noticed how profitable slave trading was, so the charter was revised in 1663 to include slave trading. We bet he made millions out of this selfish move. This company was dissolved in 1672. One would guess this also was the end of the king's involvement in slave trade. Well, you guessed wrong. The king faced in another direction to support this evil trade by sponsoring another company known as the Royal African Company. This company would then transport more enslaved people from Africa to America than any other single company in the history of slave trade. King James II. Fun fact for you, King James II is England's last Roman Catholic king, and New York City was named after him as the Duke of York before ascending to the throne in 1685. He reigned from 1685 to 1688. Remember the Royal African Company? The one mentioned earlier? King James was the governor of this company. Because of his extraordinary services under this position, the company awarded him 500 guineas. Today this would be about 500 pounds. While this might look like change today, its original value would be over 100,000 pounds today. James II was Royal African Company's largest shareholder. According to several historians, James II made 6,210 pounds from his investment. This amount is equivalent to 1 million pounds today. William III and Mary II. As we might all know, royals marry within royalty. This forces them to marry their relatives, mostly their cousins. The main reason for this royal incest is to preserve their breed, strengthen dynasties, and peace. This was the case for William III and Mary II. This odd couple reigned as co-monarchs from 1689. In the same year, William III accepted a free transfer from the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, Edward Colston. The shares given to William were worth 1,000 pounds. This would be equivalent to over 160,000 pounds today. Historians say this odd couple made further wealth from these shares as England's profits from slavery expanded. Talk of couple goals. Queen Anne. You have probably heard of the N-word before, the word that is very offensive to the black community. Queen Anne's actions might have contributed to sparking the offense that comes with the N-word. The Queen reigned from 1702 to 1714. Just like modern business and their huge money-making contracts, the Queen secured a business contract from Spain called Asiento de Negros. In English, this would say contract of importing Negroes. Now you see why we think the Queen helped in making the N-word the most offensive word to the black community. This word was primarily used to describe black slaves back then. Anyway, back to the contract. The contract served as a license to conduct slave trade in the Spanish colonies and a further agreement on supplying 4,800 slaves annually for 30 years to Spanish America. The Queen fulfilled this contract using a company called the South Sea Company. This contract said to have dramatically expanded the nation's slave trading activities and of course brought in a lot of money for the monarchy. King George I. King George ruled from 1714 to 1727. Like the other aforementioned monarchs, he was heavily involved in the slave trade, but he was not as lucky as the other kings and queens who made millions from it, as you will later find out. George I was the governor of the South Sea Company. Many historians say he had a substantial share in this company, which would later disappoint him. Have you heard of the South Sea Bubble? The South Sea Bubble was the financial collapse of the South Sea Company. Many investors made losses to this huge financial crush, which was later deemed the world's first financial crush and the world's first Ponzi scheme. This financial crush was then named the South Sea Bubble. Notable people like Sir Isaac Newton lost as much as £40 million of today's value. This is why I said the king was not as lucky as the other monarchs in slave trading, as he made a significant loss in this scheme. Some historians, however, argue that the king still made significant profits from this business despite the financial crush. King George II. King George II equally made profits like King George I. He was also a governor of the South Sea Company, and this company took 41,923 African captives on its ships between 1714 and 1740. Approximately 7,000 people died on these voyages. We might not have found strong links to justify how other royals benefited from this trade, but many royals supported this evil trade directly and indirectly. Notably, George III, he opposed the slave trade abolishment movements behind the scenes, thereby perpetrating the continuation of this business. George IV also failed to support the abolishment movements. He ruthlessly suppressed uprisings by enslaved people. In 1823, he instructed British authorities to do on-spot executions of everyone who had rebelled. 10 people were hanged, then decapitated, and their heads were displayed on spikes. William IV also opposed abolition of the slave trade. He befriended slave owners, and he made several speeches at public events where he claimed that slavery was vital to prosperity. Other kings like James I and Charles I supported this trade by granting royal-connected merchants a monopoly to trade with Africa. We have discussed a little too much on the bad guys. The question now is, do we have the good royals in history who stood against the slave trade? Most of the royals were vague in their involvement with slave trade. However, notable royals like George III in his teen years is said to have been against slave trade. An essay wrote by him as a teen was found, arguing in his essay that slavery had no moral basis. This letter has been used by many as some evidence that the future king was against slave trade. Another monarch who showed little interest in slave trade was Queen Victoria and her first cousin husband, Prince Albert. However, this may have been because she became queen around the time slaves were being freed from slavery. Drop a comment in the comment box and tell us what you know about slavery and the British royals, and while you are at it, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out these videos you might like.